Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I'm going to count to 3. There will not be a 4. Give me the code.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten and I'm joined by Chad Gross. How are you doing, Chad?
I am doing very well. Excited to be back in the podcast saddle. How about you?
Yeah, doing good in the holiday spirit, and I'm just pondering what sort of like die-hard Christmas party, Christmas jumper sort of thing I should buy this year. Should it be the now I have a machine gun ho ho ho, or something more like Nakatomi Christmas Party 1984? I don't know yet. So those are the sort of decisions I've been, making at the moment.
Hey, I was at a bookstore over here called Second and Charles yesterday. And I saw, I think I've told you about this before, but they actually have a Die Hard storybook, like a kid's picture book of Die Hard. But this one came with a John McClane plushie. Nice. Yeah. Yeah, it was when at the end where he's got the gun taped onto his back and he doesn't have a shirt on. Yeah, and he's got just the pants and he's barefoot. Yeah, it was that one. And he even has his arms up. And nice. I thought, oh man, that's pretty sweet. So, yeah. So what things have you done for your Die Hard party in the past? Like, what are a few? I mean, obviously you watched the film, duh. Yeah. But I mean,
we haven't done any, pin the tail on Hans Gruber or anything like that. Now, I promise you though, I was thinking, what could we do, for the next party?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, could I get some sort of like tin box? And get everybody a Zippo lighter, and they could all pose inside the box.
Oh, that's
like
a great idea.
Like get pictures like with a lighter, and then be like, "Come to LA, we'll have some fun." Have a few laughs.
Come out to the coast, we'll have a few laughs. Yeah, that's great. I love that.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome listeners to the podcast. This one's a little bit different because there's been a little bit of a gap because we decided, holiday time, less listening time, maybe for some people, also less time to record and schedule folks. But also we'll tell you about a little bit in a few minutes. But let me tell you what you'll be hearing in today's episode, just in case you're about ready to slide the finger across to delete the thing. So what we're talking about today, first we're going to do a little bit of catch up. And so it's not a formal interview or anything like that. What's going on? What are we watching? What are we reading? And then some changes we're going to be making to the podcast. By the way, we're also celebrating 14 years of the podcast first episode, which was December 7th, 2009. So yeah, wow. That was the first one.
Wow.
I know. We'll talk about things we've learned about apologetics from podcasting. And at the end, we'll probably talk about Dune and Ghostbusters and things like that.
Yeah.
Now, before we start, though, I want to just ask you guys that are listening, send us an email, please, at podcast@apologetics315.com. I want to know, how long have you been listening? Were you listening back then? What have you enjoyed or learned from the podcast? And their subjects or directions you'd like us to take in the future? And are there any guests you'd like to hear from? Or just drop us a line and let us know why you've listened, or send us a Christmas greeting or something. And thank you so much for listening. And so, Chad, I know there's something that you really want to talk about first. What is that?
Yes. So the new Ghostbusters trailer dropped. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And I am super excited about it. But I'm also hesitant. So I will explain why I'm excited, and then I will explain why I'm hesitant. I'm excited because I've read in multiple places that it's heavily inspired by the real Ghostbusters cartoon, which I was a really big fan of. And I've always thought there were a lot of great concepts that they could take from those cartoons and turn into really amazing films. I read a Ghostbusters book, kind of a Ghostbusters history book over the summer, and it was kind of amazing to me how much trouble there was with so many different versions of Ghostbusters 3 being trapped in creation purgatory or whatever you want to say. And I was even thinking while I was reading it, why would they not just take storylines from the cartoon that were really good? There's so many of them. So it looks like that's what they're doing. So I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited that the original.
I'm very excited. I want you to get down there, watch the movie, and tell me all about it.
You're never going to regret this, Ray. So also, Walter Peck is returning in this one. And so I am super excited to see if he and Venkman have any good interactions, because those are obviously some of my favorite parts of the original. Now, the reason I'm a little hesitant.
You're worried.
A little worried.
Your glasses are fogging up. You're so worried. Your glasses are fogging up.
Yeah. It's a little better now. Okay. I turned the heat down. For those listeners that are wondering what the heck he's talking about, my girls and my wife are cranking the heat up. So my glasses were literally fogging up during pre-podcast discussion. But I'm a little concerned because I know that you were not like a huge fan of the way Afterlife ended. But I was. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was a perfect send-off, and I don't know how they can top it. So there's a part of me that wishes they would just leave well enough alone. But there is another part of me that says, hey, if this movie is as good as Dan Aykroyd claims it's going to be, then I'm excited about it. However, there's a voice in the back of my head that also remembers that Dan Aykroyd said that the female Ghostbusters movie was really good. So I don't know how much I can take that at face value.
He had to say that. He can't say the truth.
He did.
He's being paid.
He did. So anyway, I am super excited. Now, did you get a chance to watch the trailer? I know I sent it to you when it dropped.
Yes. Now it's not burned in my memory as things are about Ghostbusters that they are for you. I watched the Dune 2 trailer, and that's kind of like, I'm more excited about that because it was supposed to drop in November and now it's March. So sad days, but.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So not to hijack the Ghostbusters thing, but no,
not at all.
It looks interesting. Like sometimes you look at a trailer and you think, no, this ain't it, Chief. And
right.
Other times you're like, ooh, this will be good. For me, it's like, oh, okay, it doesn't look like they're ruining anything yet.
Agreed.
And so I'm always taking like trailers with a little bit of hesitancy, especially when they keep trying to go with franchises and stuff, but it looks fair. It looks fair.
I will say
it looks interesting.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly my thought. The last thing I'll say that I found really kind of funny is, as you know, I'm a member of a few Ghostbuster fan pages on Facebook, and I really just kind of casually follow them.
Wait, Chad, are you one of those people who, when they comment, it says top contributor next to their name?
No, I'm actually not. So,
no, you're like group expert. Is that the tag?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah, they refer all Ghostbuster questions to me. Exactly. But
you're on call 24 hours a day for all your supernatural needs.
Exactly. I'm ready to believe you. But so at the end of the trailer, there is this scene where Paul Rudd and Phoebe and the mom and well, anyway, the new team, if you will, which I think is going to be the new team and the new one, is all are in these red winter coats because everything is frozen over. Well, I thought it was hilarious on these Facebook pages that Ghostbusters fans just went bonkers over these winter coats. They're just red coats that have the Ghostbuster emblem on the sleeve. That's literally the extent.
It's merch time, baby.
Yeah. So I saw pictures of Ghostbuster fans who had ordered coats, ordered patches, ironed the patches on their coats for their kids. Oh, I mean, all like hardcore. So whenever people listen to me and think, wow, that guy's got problems, that always grounds me a little bit. Like, hey, at least I'm not there. You know, at least I'm not there. This
is a perfect transition to our topic today: how to find out if you're in a cult.
And Chad is right on the line.
Chad, I've got a few people who are joining us for the podcast right now. This is an intervention.
No. Oh, man. I knew I was being set up. Oh, I won't tell him about my spores, molds, and fungus collection.
Okay, sorry. Carry on.
Oh no, that's
So it's
I'm
the
just
coats.
oh, that was all. I just found it hilarious that, I thought at the end I found it more humorous how Paul Rudd kind of did the ho 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 kind of thing. Whereas I didn't even really notice the coats I didn't notice much where, man, it just kind of took off. So,
and then you went on to criticize those obsessive people who are so into Ghostbusters that they would do that.
That's
terrible.
Right. And I went over and dusted off my 5 shelves of Ghostbuster merchandise while doing that. Exactly.
Yeah, like coats. Or I just draw the line at coats. Okay. All right.
You gotta have a standard. By what standard? Sorry, I went into Frank Turek mode there. Sorry about that.
Oh, man. Oh, well, all right. Well, speaking of transitioning to something else, that's a perfect segue to talk about something else. I had the privilege and the honor of reading Ken Sample's book, his book that he's not yet released.
Oh, yes.
About logic, called Clear Thinking in a Messy World. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying, but he did tell everybody when he was on the podcast that he's writing this.
That's
and
true.
now he's got a co-author, and that is Mark Perez. But the book is great. Of course, we have to have him on when it drops because
Absolutely.
I have said to him from day one, because he's made all these resources about he's made multiple. There's certain strands that Ken Sample's known for. One would be, well, he's just awesome,
Right.
just super super genuine and Christ-like in his manner. Yeah. But logic's a big thing. Critical thinking, also lifelong learning, and reading great books and things like that. And so when you get input from him, you realize that, it's not a waste of time to be interested in things and to study things for their intrinsic value,
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that logic book Clear Thinking in a Messy World has done for me. It was like, oh, okay, that's kind of released me to go deep on subjects that I'm interested in, and to like, yeah, I want to explore this area or that. But in the book, he talks, of course, about critical thinking and logic and informal fallacies, but it's all got this apologetics flavor cooked in, and this idea of lifelong learning and the life of the Christian mind, and a real emphasis on growing and developing thinking skills. So yeah, it was a great book. How we're trying to find the one book to rule them all, as far as like a logic, critical thinking one.
That's what I was going to ask.
Ticks all the boxes.
Is this it?
Yeah. Now previously we had said that Travis Dickinson's book was in that spot. Now I'd say it's a close second. It's a close second with Ken Sample's on top, because it ticks all those boxes, and it's very accessible. He does reference Travis Dickinson in his book and some of the stuff that he said in his recent writings. So it was good to see that there's input from that strand as well.
Yes. And for those listeners who want to check that book out, that is available right now. And that is called Logic in the Way of Jesus, Thinking Critically and Christianly. And of course, again, that's by Travis Dickinson, the foreword by Mr. Paul Coban.
Travis's book is more kind of like a logic book, like smashed together with J.P. Moreland, Love God with All Your Mind, and with a lot of influence from Dallas Willard. But Ken Sample's is more like, no, this is all Ken. It's really just like, now he has a co-author. He has his own specialty, so they've written and they've majored on different sections of the book. But it's got that Ken stamp on it. You definitely, it's like, if you read it and you knew Ken Samples, you'd be like, yeah, this is classic Ken. So it's awesome. So yeah, I'll be recommending that one when it arrives. So
just speaking of Ken Samples, I've been reading through his book that we had him on to talk about, called Christianity Cross-Examined, with a Christian friend of mine and an atheist friend of mine. And it has really been, we get together approximately once a month and just discuss each chapter. It's been really fruitful, and once again, just giving me an appreciation for the clarity of his writing. Very appreciative of that. Now, a book, I'm reading like 4 books right now, so I'm not going to go over all of them. But one of them I'm reading is Bullies and Saints, An Honest Look at the Good and Evil of Christian History by John Dickinson. And thus far, I am really impressed with kind of the levity he brings to the topic. Obviously, he is looking at some of the atrocities that have been committed in the history of Christendom. And then, of course, he also wants to point out the good. And then, of course, how do we make sense of that in the context of Jesus's teachings? And so that has been really helpful for me to read through and highly recommend it. And you might be hearing more from Mr. Dickinson in the near future. Yes.
Yeah, and I want to point people to his podcast too. It's called On Deceptions, and it's really well produced, and it's not like super frequent, but when does come out, it's just really well produced, and it's got good music and sound and, good structure and stuff. It's not like just two dudes talking to each other about movies and things,
Yeah,
so it's actually worth listening to,
Yeah. Hold on a second. I got to get my red winter coat. Anyway, another book I'm reading is by Brant Pitra, and I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but it's Pitre. And that book is The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. And I have really been enjoying this one. As Brian, the historical Jesus is by far and away my favorite topic to read about. And I am in the section right now. There's about 4 chapters where he argues for the original authorship of the Gospels. He pushes back against the so-called anonymous gospel theory. And I've actually I started a series on Truth Bomb about it too, for listeners who would be interested. But it is really well written and clear. And I think just a great book for people who have questions about the foundation of who Jesus is and how can we know. And so that's been one that I've really enjoyed as well.
Cool. Well, we'll link to those in the show notes, and we'll point you there if you're interested.
So, Brian, one of the reasons why we wanted to do a podcast today is because we wanted to talk about, you and I got together and talked about the podcast, where both of us are at in our personal lives, and of course, how we think the podcast is doing. And we came up with some ideas that we want to implement that will hopefully make it more manageable for us, but also keep it engaging and helpful in equipping people to reach people with the gospel. And so did you want to talk about some of those changes?
Well, when I first started the podcast, there's been a while during the podcast where you get into the sort of the routine of one podcast a week. And back in the old days when I was blogging too, I had the time and less kids and responsibilities, not running a business and things like that, where I would just do one podcast every week and had a real good system for that. And there was a lot of authors, a lot of thinkers I wanted to interview and stuff. So it just made sense to do a weekly podcast, and didn't sustain that forever. I took a big old hiatus until we joined forces to reboot the podcast. So listeners, by the way, if you look through the podcast feed, those numbers, like we're on like 131 or I don't know, we're around there. We're in the 130s, but that's just with me and Chad. So there's like another 100 and something episodes before that. If you keep scrolling and you're still interested in other topics, they're not like podcasts that get old in a way. Some of these resources they didn't just wilt or after like 2 weeks. They're not like, oh, today we're going to talk about what so-and-so said last week and rip it apart. These are podcasts where we want to create something that you could listen to 5 years later and you'd still get value, even though it might have been maybe a book release or something. We're trying to draw out things that are real important. But anyway, I had a tendency of thinking, well, I've got to keep this steady routine and that sort of thing. Now, I've been thinking about the amount of content out there in the world, and I've been pruning down the podcasts I listen to because, when I was doing the blog, I was just consuming everything there was. That was like, I could do that because there wasn't a ton. I could consume it all because there wasn't a ton. And now, if you wanted to listen to everything that came out, you would not have enough time. There's not enough time to listen to what is produced in a week from all the different ministries or whatever. And there's a lot of recycled stuff. People are on book tours and you hear authors interviewed 5 times. If you listen to 5 different podcasts, you could listen to that author. Oh, now they're on this one. Now they're on that one. And it's not just in the apologetics world. That happens just in hey, you're in success and self-development or business. Someone's going to come out with a book. They're going to get on the top podcast. They're going to do their tour. And unless the interviews are really awesome like us, they'll just ask the same questions because these people, they'll also usually send out, here's your suggested questions. And I hate that. I know that there's a marketing machine and I don't like being part of a marketing machine. At any rate, there's this pressure I've noticed to, if you create a schedule and you say you're going to release a podcast every week or whatever your time frame is, then there's this pressure to, who's our next guest going to be? And instead of choosing that based upon what you think is going to create value or that you're really interested in, or, you know what, people need to hear this, you're selecting your guest based upon, oh, yeah, we can talk to them. They know apologetics things or whatever.
Yes.
Now, hopefully that hasn't influenced us too much, but it has, and to a certain extent, because you can't not be affected by it. Just the same way as if you're being paid to do your podcast or trying to monetize your podcast, which I don't, or we don't get any money from it. Now, the moment you put a dollar sign next to your podcast, now your choices are being dictated to some extent by that dollar sign, because you're thinking, can I promote their book and get people to click on the Amazon link that is going to give me an affiliate? Because if they buy that book, or even if they don't buy the book, if they buy a barbecue next week, I'm going to get $15. You know what I'm saying? So
Yes.
that will influence what your content you're generating. It also influences the idea of we need to put out one every week, because we got to keep that thing churning, because we don't want to lose listeners. We need to have so there's all these sort of there's a system that's been created in the podcast world that I think skews the things that are created so that you are just trying to keep people watching, keep people clicking. And I hate that. I despise it.
Right.
So the weekly show kind of puts pressure to sustain a schedule that may not be sustainable. And to be honest, if I tried to do the same thing next year as we did this year, I'd be like, I'm going to get burned out pretty soon, and we're going to run out of guests. I'm going to lose interest in what we're what we're trying to do.
If I could interject too real quick, one of the things listeners should keep in mind as well is that not only are we talking about, the interviewing part and the book reading part, that takes time, but of course that's the fun part. But then there's also the editing, which, takes up quite a bit of time. And so, we're talking about a big commitment, which we're honored to do it and we love to do it. But at the same time, keeping up that pace can be rather tiresome for anybody.
Yeah. Now, if there was no other apologetics, if apologetics resources were sparse, it would be like, dude, we've got a job to do. We need to equip people.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, if I needed to find an answer, I could go onto YouTube and I'll find it pretty quick. If I'm an atheist or if I'm a Christian, or I could go to ChatGPT and I could say, summarize the ontological argument for me, explain that a little bit more, blah, blah, blah. And the tools and the resources available are pretty much, you're not going to reach the bottom of them. So you could, if everybody stopped creating content right now, you would have the rest of your life to consume and not get to the end of it. So from that aspect, I don't think there's a huge need for me to podcast. Like, you can run me over with a bus, or run us over with a Ecto 1, and and it's not going to hurt anything. Let me just rewind a bit. Like, when the blog started, it was 2007. That was 15, 16 years ago when we were just starting out blogging. And it was like, if you think about it, that was before there was an iPhone. You know what I mean? And
yes.
And I was like, if you said the word podcast to someone, they'd be like, what the heck is that? Mm-hmm. But I was kind of like, yeah, I think that's something cool to do. And then we did the first podcast in 2009. So 14 years ago, happy anniversary. That was kind of cool because it was creating a stream of good resources for folks. And I think that was really helpful. Now, I don't see it as that's something I should really get into. Like, if I weren't doing it right now, I wouldn't start, It's one of those things where it's already been filled. So what do? My thought is that if we put pressure on to create episodes every week, we will not create the best content or the useful content. We will create duplicate content. So I want to focus on things that we're both interested in, either me or you, or both of us are highly interested in, or that we think, you know what? No one has asked this person these questions yet, and we need to know the answers. Mm-hmm. Or, hey, we really want to go deeper on the topic of this or topic of that.
And this also stems out of us having that reflective discussion and thinking that some of the podcasts the best podcasts that we both agreed we've done are those podcasts where we've reached out to authors and said, hey, we'd like to talk to you about this specific topic. And it wasn't necessarily a topic that they had written on or published in. It was just we had seen some of their work, whether it was a YouTube video or a debate they had done. And it was really in that spirit of, we just really want to talk to you about this topic because we think it's important and we have lots of questions. And that made us go, wow, well, maybe that should be more of the theme of some of our podcasts, or what are we really interested in, and who would be the best person to ask those questions to?
Yeah. And so there's the time aspect, both in how frequent an episode comes out, the amount of time it takes and energy to create those, and making sure that there are things that really matter to either us or the listener or the times we're in. And it's not been duplicated by more popular channels and things like that. So with that in mind, the idea is like, okay, if you listener, now talking to you, if you're want to know what to expect for 2024, I almost said 2014.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to say, okay, so for anybody listening right now, Brian, and they're like, oh no, is he quitting? No, he's not. But tell us what these changes are going to look like.
We will not have a set time frame or a release schedule for the podcast. They'll come out based upon how interested we are in a particular topic when we schedule that interview or create our own content or whatever. And it might be a week between them, might be 2 weeks, might be 3. I can't imagine it going beyond once a month, as far as that goes. But we want to do ones that we're really excited about, or we think and it's also going to create value. One thing we promise, we will never try to sell you our apologetics program. We will never ask you to give, money all the time. We'll never monetize the podcast. We'll never try to promote our podcast to try to keep it on top or ask you to subscribe 85 billion times or anything like that. And we're never going to try to make a name for ourselves. Hey, if you want to invite us to talk, great. But we're not.
If you want to get me a red winter coat with a Ghostbusters emblem on the sleeve, that would be outstanding. I could give my address or contact me through Facebook. I mean, I'm happy to accept that. Just as a small token to say, hey, Chad, thanks. I mean, I wouldn't say no. That's all I'm trying to say.
They're going to get you a Crunch bar.
Yeah, exactly. Because you've earned this.
You've earned it.
The other thing too that we talked about, another idea is it kind of dawned on us. Why does every release have to be like a full blown interview? We also have an opportunity to release some inspiring quotes. We talked about encouragements from an apologetic standpoint or sharing the gospel, counterpoints. For example, recently a atheist said such and such. Well, consider this from this leading apologist, or consider this rebuttal, or also even just a book recommendation. So just because we may not be releasing constantly full blown interviews, you will see a steady stream of those types of little encouragements.
Here's just another thought I had before we move on to what have we actually learned in doing this stuff.
Yes.
There's the idea of adding. If you listen to most podcasts, you're adding to your knowledge. You're just adding. And after a while, you've got this stack of information and you're adding. One more might not really move the needle for you. Whereas if you have not listened to a lot of apologetics content, listen to a few episodes and be like, wow, that's really added a lot, because comparing to what I already know, that's a lot. But what if we could multiply? So, as famously stated by Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. So, this idea, I like, in my own mind, I think about things that are force multipliers. And what I guess the best way to illustrate that would be like a lever. It allows you to exert greater force on an object, multiplying the force you apply, or a pulley. It allows you to raise or move something heavy because you're just putting in less effort. You're multiplying the force, right? So you're lifting the same amount of weight, but you're doing half of the amount of work. So things like critical thinking and good reasoning skills, or knowing how to ask the right questions on a subject, I think those are like force multipliers. And there's certain principles sometimes that come to my mind, or like, oh, aha, a breakthrough idea or something like that. If we can maybe have smaller episodes, like you mentioned, where we just talk about a certain thing that we think really makes a difference, it's not just adding content to you. It will, hey, if you use, like, for instance, if you know logic and you're really good at critical thinking skills, that everything you know just became twice more potent, or, because it becomes a lever. You've force multiplied. And so those are the sorts of things I would rather try to bring to the table if I can. We want to make sure that when you listen, we're either adding value or multiplying, thoughts and things that actually help.
And just to kind of piggyback on that, we've talked about how our goal in the podcast is to not just make content, but also to make content that's actually helpful and encourages people in their own faith, and then also gives people the tools, puts tools in people's hands to also point other people to the person of the faith, namely Jesus. And so that's what we want to strive to continue to do in just a little bit of a different fashion.
All right. So what have we learned? I've written down maybe three, four things, although there are 10,000. But you want to start us off, Chad?
I wrote down
new segment here.
Yes, I wrote down 4 things I've learned, and I didn't try. How sometimes when you overthink something, it ends up coming across very prepared and boring. I tried to just what were the things that just came to mind off the top of my head, and here were the things. So the first thing I learned is to be careful in your thinking and not jump to conclusions. I think sitting through these interviews and listening to all these very careful thinkers who have really done some deep dives into important topics or responded to certain arguments or presented certain arguments, I think that one of the things that has impressed upon me is, first of all, how careful they've been through the thinking and how much time they've taken to think clearly through whatever the issue or the argument is, or the counter argument. And that just says to me, I would like to see, and I'm of course pointing the finger at myself as well as anybody else, I would like to see that happen more online as far as the thinking and the interactions, instead of jumping to conclusions. For example, this is a prime example that just happened. I saw on Twitter a Christian saying, atheists, people who claim that everything came from nothing. And I just thought, okay, you're trying to score a cheat point there. I get it. But, and I obviously think the universe did come into being out of nothing. And I think we have good evidence for that. But not all atheists believe that. And so instead of just jumping to that conclusion and using it as your little slam dunk tweet, why don't you be careful? And if you're in an interaction with an atheist, how about you ask them, hey, why is there anything at all? Or how do you think the universe began? Do you think it's always been here, or do you think it's eternal? And so just being careful in your thinking and not jumping to conclusions and making assumptions, I think, is something that's really been impressed upon me by the various people we've talked to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sort of lines up in a way with, I also wrote down 4 things. And my first one is know both sides of the issue, not just my side is right. Just over the course of time,
Yes.
There's this aspect of sometimes I see folks they've had just enough apologetics to know their side and proclaim it very loudly and not have any clue what the other person believes. And so they're inevitably are whacking at straw men because they are assuming, just like you said, jumping to a conclusion of what the other person believes because, they have that label, they must believe this. So therefore, I'm going to use that. And then also sort of along with that in this, knowing both sides of the issue is that there, you want to understand both sides is like there's nuances and variations on both sides. So just because someone is an atheist, they don't all believe the same way. And not all people who say God created the world or believe that God created the world believe that happened on the same timeline. So, creation apologetics, people who are into creation, really major on creation in their apologetics, I think it would benefit everybody for them to just know what all the views really well so that they could actually present each one of those views real well and not say, this is the one that's right. Well, can you explain theistic evolution? well, I know it's wrong. That's so unbiblical, Instead of, they could say instead like, oh yeah, well, here's what theistic evolution believes, and this is why, and here's the good reasons for it. Now I have my differences. I don't seem to agree, and here's why. But there are a lot of great people that hold that view. So I think having an understanding of the nuances within the sides and the views is really helpful, and helps you to be charitable and not jump to conclusions, as you say.
Yeah, that's good. And honestly, man, the second thing I wrote down was be fair, but what you just expressed was pretty much what I was thinking. So I can actually go to my third point now. My third one is just be willing to challenge yourself. And what I mean by that is, and this echoes a little bit about what you just said, but it's going to go further than that, is that we all have views that we hold with an open hand. In other words, we're open to being, persuaded otherwise. And then there are other views we hold with our hand closed pretty tight because we're just more sure of them. I think for me, one of the things that I've learned over the podcast is how much I've changed my mind on things. A couple examples would be how Chris Date really challenged me on the eschatology view. And I ended up changing my view on eschatology on a couple pretty major issues, not through just the interview, but through prepping for it, also reading some things prior to interviewing him. Also, Paul Moser on suffering really kind of changed that idea, the severity of God and how I view God. It really broadened my view of suffering to the point where I ended up changing my mind and seeing that a lot differently too. And so I just learned, taking from that, of just being open to views, even if upon first sniff, if you will, you're kind of like, I don't know how I feel about that, or, oh, this isn't comfortable. Of course, continue to learn and continue to consider the argument, because it could end up getting you closer to the truth. Now, of course, there are very clear-cut things that are heretical, but I'm not including those types of things in there,
right,
in this discussion. So yeah, just be willing to challenge yourself and realize that those secondary issues are that. They're secondary. And so be willing to fine-tune those and to learn from people who have different views on those issues like you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, seeing you've skipped one, I'm going to put two in my turn.
Well, you kind of, you said it better than I would have said it, so I didn't have to, skip it.
I know, Chad.
That's always the case.
Well, my number two was, and I'll be quick on this one because we've kind of said it before, and that's asking questions and knowing how to ask the best questions to steer conversations with both disagreeable conversation partners as well as those you might be wanting to teach. So using Socratic questions to sort of guide teaching and learning, like try to do that with kids so that I'm not like just lecturing them. Sometimes that devolves into a lecture, unfortunately. But building relationships and stuff by asking questions and having genuine curiosity, or at least really care about the view of the other person and find out where they're at with things. Now, number three would be, when it comes to learning, I remember William Lane Craig said something pretty great, and it was, and he's said it a few times in different contexts, but he says, know your subject deeply, but be able to explain it simply. And I think that's sort of like the true test of whether you know a particular subject or not. I can find that out pretty quick when I explain one thing and I know that I can do it clearly and simply, and then I try to explain another thing and it's like falling flat on my face, and I thought I knew that. I guess I don't. I suppose another sort of example of that would be when you think you know a certain phrase in a different language and you've practiced it, and then you actually show up in front of that other person and you try to talk to them and you have nothing coming out of your mouth. So it's sort of the same way, is like you do have to actually be able to explain something in a simple way while knowing it deeply. That's a good way to tell if you've in a way become fluent in that particular topic. And sort of tied to that is this idea of being smart in one thing doesn't mean you're smart in another. Like, you could limit it to, I know the cosmological argument, but just because you're really good at that doesn't mean that now you can explain the ontological argument. you complete idiot when it comes to that. Like most of us.
It's funny. One of the things you've said about the ontological argument, I know this is a bit of an aside, but I think listeners will appreciate it, is you said, it's like the One Ring. No one can wield it. And that's always stuck with me. I love that quote. But anyway, but you know what?
Why do we use the ontological argument against them?
Exactly.
You can't wield it. None of us can.
It was hilarious. One of the things I remember, like, this is back when I was just getting to know you, and you would send me texts and say, dude, I'm interviewing so-and-so. Do you have any questions for him? And that was always so fun to feel like I was a little bit of a part of it. And I remember when you interviewed Alvin Plantinga, you asked him, like, how would you use the ontological argument in a conversation? And there was like this long pause, and he just went, I wouldn't.
Oh, man.
And I remember you being kind of like, That was great.
That was like one of the best and worst interviews of all time. Like, oh, wow, this world-class philosopher. Let me just go show everybody how bad this can be,
Well, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't derail what you were saying, but I had to get that in there. I had to get that in there.
I'm happy that you did.
Yeah.
So the other thing would be thinking that, oh, I'm great in theology, therefore I'm great in apologetics. Or, oh, I'm great in apologetics, therefore I've got or have great theology. Or, you have to be realistic and realize that you might have a large vocabulary, but doesn't mean that you can get up and speak, competently.
Wow,
that's
a great point.
So being realistic about your understanding, and I suppose it's one of those things where it's like the more you know, the more you realize how little you know.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
All right. What's your next?
Yeah. So my last one is, and I want to make sure I communicate this one because I don't want it to come off as pejorative, because I don't mean it this way, is that not all the best apologists out there, this is one of the things I've learned from the podcast, are the kind of the pop apologists. And what I mean by that is, there are certainly apologists out there that are very popular and also very, very effective. But some of the podcasts that we've had that I have walked away from, either changed in my thinking or really challenged in my thinking, have been thinkers who I'm not sure I would have read their stuff if we weren't doing the podcast, because they're not always as popular and in the limelight as some of these other thinkers. Two gentlemen that came to mind right away who are at the very top of my list these days are Paul Gold and Travis Dickinson. These two guys were not guys I was aware of, that I had heard of. And their work is, I've already recommended one of Travis's books to my agnostic buddy, and we're going to get together and talk about it. I think they do a great job interacting with the best of atheist objections, but they do so in a way that a layman can understand. And to me, that's really impressive. And we need more people writing like Travis and Paul. And so my lesson, again, my takeaway is, yeah, these really popular apologists are great and they have great content out there, but go beyond that and discover some new thinkers, because there are a lot of great thinkers out there that just don't quite have the advertising machine behind them that some of the other guys do. And I don't mean that as an insult to any party involved. It's just something I've taken away from this.
Mm-hmm. I think number 4 for me, and it's hard to tell if it's from doing podcasting or happened through the course of doing apologetics while the podcast happened to be going on at the same time. But and that's this, I've just picked up this idea of, or seeing the importance of the logic and the critical thinking being a force multiplier, as I mentioned in a previous segment there. It really makes a big difference to have that set of tools sharpened, because you can kind of lose your sharpness on them. And so coming back to those sort of skills kind of helps. The same way as revisiting things like Kokel's Tactics, or even his new book that reminds you about conversations, and keeping that communication and thinking and communication tool set sharp is real helpful. So those are a couple of the things of the lots of things we've learned during the podcast, but those are things I wanted to bring forward. Chad, do you have any bonus things you've learned?
Yeah, there was one other thing that I was thinking about that I kind of laughed about at first, and I wasn't going to share it, but I'll share it. So before I started doing the podcast, I would listen to you interview people and listen to other people interview. And I always saw a lot of these philosophers and theologians and thinkers as kind of like larger than life. You'll remember the first time we did an interview together was with Peter S. Williams, who might be my favorite of favorites. And I was so nervous that I remember he came on the screen and it was like, whoa, it's Peter S. Williams and he's talking to me. And I think that over the 130 episodes that we've done together, it's been so impressed upon me how many of these guys and gals are just like us. They have lives, they raise kids. And I know that sounds silly, but sometimes I think we put them up on a pedestal that many of them or most of them don't ask for. Right. And they really are, while they're doing all this great work, they're also living real life. And so to me, that's been very encouraging just to know that, once again, even someone like Sean McDowell, for example, who has such a huge platform, struggles with the same things I struggle with and is trying to reach people just like I am. And so we're all in the same boat and we're all on the same team. And I find that encouraging and refreshing.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, listeners, thanks so much for listening. And I want to know what you've learned from the podcast. Have you had any favorite guests or topics? Send them to us at podcast@apologetics315.com. How long have you been listening? Have you enjoyed or learned anything from the podcast? Anything you want to do in the future? Or any guests you want to hear from? Just drop us a line and let us know how long and what you've been listening to. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for listening.
Now, one more thing. If you're still listening, stay on till after the outro, and we're going to tell you some of the craziest stories of interview excuses why people couldn't show up on time for their interviews. So after the outro, we're going to tag this on and have a listen. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening. Okay, listener, this is your little bonus content where we're going to talk about 10 different reasons or excuses we've got over the years of podcasting for people having to reschedule or miss their interview because, we live in a cancel culture, Chad. And
we do indeed.
So we'll get to our list of top 10 reasons why people have had to cancel. But the other thing that we have encountered as well as rescheduling and canceling is tech issues. So can you describe what that looks like, Chad?
Well, yes, I'll try. When the camera turns on to the guest and sometimes you're looking at them upside down or they start talking, but yet you can't hear anything they're saying or or you're looking as if like you're looking up their nose because of the camera angle or the camera's somehow moving, right away this might not be smooth.
Oh, yeah. And there's always like someone wants to use AirPods or something or not have headphones and there's echo and then we're just troubleshooting for like 15 minutes. Well, and I'm like looking on the internet for how do they've got a Windows computer. I'm like reading like, what do you call it? How to do it pages, like how to turn your sound up and things. And I always feel bad because you're like the tech guy. So I'm just over here staring at both of you like, I'll be over here if anybody needs me. Well, the other thing would be like there's been a few folks who understandably because of, let's say they're a later generation. They're not great with tech, so it's like, okay, no problem. I kind of expected this, but they went the It went a long way to get, things set up, and they just had to tweak it a little bit, work through it. But there's been, let's say there's been an episode or something where you actually interview someone who's like a media person and nothing works. Like they should be, you'd expect when you're doing an interview with someone who's like a media, focuses on doing media, that that would be like the best setup. And it was actually one of the absolute, took the longest to get things going. It was pretty amazing and impressive.
Indeed.
Yeah. So now we've got a list, our top 10 reasons for rescheduling an interview with our guests.
And they get more absurd as we go.
I'll let them judge.
We'll let you judge, but that's for us.
I'll start with number 10.
All right.
And they forgot. They just forgot. So can we reschedule? Totally forgot. So it was just us. It's just some dude in Northern Ireland and some guy in Maryland in his basement. And wearing a red coat.
So they were like, "Oh, Vinkman, I'm sorry. I just forgot."
Yeah.
So that's number 10. Number 9, understandable, was I wasn't feeling well, or I'm not feeling well. So someone being under the weather and not being able to make it.
Yeah. Well, that's happened. The forgot things happened at least a couple times or more.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't feeling well. Probably, I'd say if you told me there was 3 times, I'd say I would believe you, but certainly once or twice.
Right.
Number 8, the internet here at the office has been in and out all day. Or my internet connection is rubbish. That has happened. Well, certainly to reschedule an interview, it has happened 2, maybe 3 times, but people are always saying it and we're always dropping people. So that's happened a lot. Yeah.
Yes. Number 7 on our top 10 is I missed my flight. So they couldn't make the interview because they were stranded somewhere, I suppose.
That's completely forgivable, but it was like, wow, that was kind of cool. Like, that was like something really, important happened to stop it. It wasn't like, I forgot. Like, I missed my flight. Like, dude, that's legit, man. Okay, yes, I'll give you that.
I agree.
Okay. Number 6, my personal assistant, the personal assistant is the person I'm interacting with, and they say, I thought he knew, but I can't find him anywhere. I've tried to call his phone.
So there was a kidnapping? No, I'm just kidding.
I can't find him anywhere. So yeah, we're just kind of left hanging.
Yes. Number 5 on our top 10 list. I'm kind of taking my cue from David Letterman here. Computer broke. My computer broke or crashed or whatever you want to call it, which we were a little confused on that one because I remember thinking, nobody's got a laptop you can borrow.
Like, what is being used to email this message to me?
Sorry, I'm pounding the table. Sorry. Anyway.
Right.
Oh, that was good.
Number 4. Number 4.
Yes.
I forgot. I'm speaking at a conference today. In about 2 hours or something, So, that someone was speaking at a conference and, they couldn't make it. I thought that was funny because, like, if it were me, it's probably something they do all the time. But for me, I'd be like, no, that's the only thing I'm thinking about that day.
Same here.
I forgot I've got a conference I'm speaking at.
Yeah, it just shows you perspective. Like when I've spoken at 2 conferences in my day, and I think I was like so nervous setting up to the conference. That's all I could think about. But anyway, that just shows you perspective, the difference between an amateur and a professional, right? All right. Number 3 is pretty classic, ladies and gentlemen. Pretty classic. I have to cancel because my gardener is coming over.
Those tools,
I think noise. Yes, I think the concern was while we were recording that the lawn tools were going to be too loud. And so, yes, number 3, my gardener's coming over. I remember getting that text thinking, it's Christmas time. I'll quote Christmas Vacation. I remember thinking, you serious, Clark?
It's I don't care. It's like but it's funny. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
Oh, yeah.
I totally get it. I don't care. It totally makes perfect sense. I'd be the same way. But
Yes.
it was just it's one of those things where it's like, oh, that's odd.
Right.
That is odd. Like, because you can't help but envision what's going on. And then then the day of the next interview, like that reschedule, because I mean, we had to schedule all three of us.
Yes.
It was like, oh, I hope his gardener isn't coming.
I hope the pool man isn't coming. I can really throw things off.
I got a guy laying shingles today. Oh, sorry, the Christmas lights are going up this week.
We have a lot of inflatables. Oh gosh, I'm gonna cry again. I'm good.
Wow.
Okay. You are crying. You're crying. Yeah.
I know. I've been shot already. Okay.
What am I doing in Mexico?
All right. So number 2 was, I'm sorry if he's listening. He's probably not listening. So we have to reschedule because I got a new Jeep and I can't get to the studio because I can't put the top up until my wife comes home for like another hour.
Yes.
Oh man. Wow.
As it happens.
I was like, you know what? I totally get it. I don't know how many times.
All right. Number 1, my favorite by far. Not even a close second. Number 1 on our top 10 reasons why people have canceled. And I love this guy, by the way. But he had to reschedule because he realized he scheduled a podcast over his honeymoon. And he thought maybe it would not be the best time.
Ooh. Wow. Wow.
Yes. So be like, honey, I'll be right there. I've got to talk to Brian and Chad.
Oh, man.
Keep the room service warm.
Oh, dear.
And by the way, if anybody happens to hear this and we're referring to you, this is all in good fun. And we realize that we've probably canceled certain things for silly reasons as well, or just funny reasons. So,
no, but, it's just fun.
It's all in good fun. We love you. We love you.
Yes. So here's to 2024. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for listening. And we will be back with an interview with Hugh Ross. So we'll talk to you soon.
Later.